for having me. It's really a joy to be here with you all. Um, Before we dig into the Matthew reading tonight and the King quote tonight, I actually want to step back just for a second and go back towards the very beginning of the Bible and start with the book of Judges. In my ministry, I've led Bible studies on the book of Judges twice, both times a 6-week study where we work through the book from start to finish. And for those who might be less familiar, Judges can be a really difficult chunk of scripture. It's violent and it's disturbing at times, but the overarching narrative of this book is about a society that's just absolutely deteriorating in terms of its morality. It's losing its way, it's falling away from God, it's falling away from faithfulness. And I read this piece of commentary when I was preparing for this study, and it's always stuck with me. And the commentator pointed out that in the book of Judges and beyond, you can gauge the spiritual health and well-being of a community by the way that that community treats women, in particular in the book of Judges, but also in the way that that community treats its most vulnerable members, whomever they are. You can tell everything you need to know about the spiritual well-being of a people by the way that they treat the vulnerable and marginalized poor people among them. And this commentator was pointing out that in Judges, as the story spins out and the society grows further and further from God, their abuse of vulnerable people just increases and increases and increases. Now, with that in mind, there's probably all kinds of things that we can unfortunately infer about the spiritual health of our nation and our world when we think about all of the atrocities and abuses that we see playing out around us. But for now, keeping this idea in mind, we'll leave Judges and we'll jump forward to this passage from Matthew. I think Jesus here is making this same point, but as Jesus often does, he's doing so in an even more dramatic and direct way. Jesus doesn't just say, I can gauge your relationship with God based on how you treat suffering people. He says, the way that you treat suffering people literally is the way that you treat God. There are no degrees of separation. The interactions are one and the same. Christ, God incarnate, dwells within the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed, the suffering. And so poverty that's inflicted on the poor, violence that's inflicted on the poor is inflicted on Christ himself. And the apathy that some might have toward the plight of the poor is apathy directed at the suffering of God. If we want to know where God is in our world, then we are to look wherever it is that people are suffering and being mistreated. Christ tells us in the scripture that the poor are the embodiment of Christ in our world. And Dorothy Day, a hero of mine, picked up this thread when she said, I really only love God as much as I love the person I love the least. I really only love God as much as I love the person I love the least. She's getting at this same idea that our relationships with people who are left behind or abandoned or ignored or forgotten about or abused are inseparable from our relationship with God. And the way that this is often interpreted and thought about by people of faith is that we have to do our best to show compassion and love for all people who enter into our immediate spheres, right? We need to not deny people whatever individual act of charity we're able to provide throughout our everyday lives. And I do think that that's an important lesson. Beyond those simple acts of charity, I think reflecting on who the people are, who the populations of people are that we as individuals, or maybe more importantly, we as a society love the least is really important. Who are the people around us that embody God and are being mistreated? But of course, we also know that this kind of traditional interpretation also falls somewhat short because God's investment in the world isn't limited to personal, individualized engagement. God is in the business of transforming communities and transforming societies and transforming the world. And that's what the Reverend Dr. King offers us when he picks up this thread with the quote that we heard read tonight. Apart from our individual responsibilities to care for one another, we have a societal responsibility to care for everyone. The faithfulness and holiness and morality of our community is judged by the way that the community at large treats the poor and marginalized, by the way that it treats God incarnate in our world. And here's where we bump up against one of the lies of white Christian nationalism that is really pervasive, this idea that we can find favor with God while turning our backs on others. The truth is that we can't be close to God and also abandon suffering people. The prophet Amos tells us that if we aren't caring for the poor, if we're perpetuating poverty, if we're complicit in letting people suffer under unjust laws and systems and structures, under war, not only will God not hear our worship, but God actually despises our worship. Judges and Amos and Matthew, they all make clear that we cannot separate out our treatment of our poorest, most vulnerable neighbors and our righteousness in the eyes of God. And so if we are to live in a faithful Christian way, we need to not only offer personal, individualized charity and compassion that keeps people alive in a direct and immediate needs-focused way, but we also need to answer Christ's call, echoed by Day, echoed by King, to reform our society in a way that ushers in the kingdom of heaven, which in its simplest form is a place where poverty is no more. And actually, a mass email from the Kairos Center that I received this week opened up this text a little bit further for me. On Wednesday afternoon, Kairos sent out an email giving thanks for the announcement of a 4-day ceasefire in Gaza. And the email pointed out that the ceasefire agreement was the direct result of a global grassroots movement, including poor and dispossessed people. It pointed out that the voices of the people have the power to shift the global landscape, and in this case, it did. And in reading this email and reflecting on this text in preparation for this service, another reading of Matthew 25 occurred to me. If the person of Jesus Christ resides within the poor and dispossessed, then that means I think that the divine power of Jesus Christ resides within the poor and the dispossessed. The divine power of Jesus Christ that performs miracles, that commands storms to be calmed, that heals ailments and brings the dead back to life, that casts out demons and evil, that challenges the authority of the empire, that calls people to resist military occupation and oppression, that calls people to let go of everything they think they know about how the world works and to instead embrace a divine vision of a world that works for all people. The power that lifts up the lowly and casts down the mighty, the power that led people into direct confrontation with the powers of evil and sin and death, the power that ultimately vanquishes those things and triumphs in resurrection. Matthew 25 tells us that that power resides within the hungry, thirsty, the naked, the sick, the lonely, the poor, the dispossessed, the marginalized, the abandoned, the victimized, the left behind, the ignored, the forgotten about. The divine power of Christ resides within a movement of those whom society has kicked to the bottom. That's where the power is found to shift national and global landscapes. That's where the power is found to join God in ushering in a new kind of kingdom where no one is hungry, no one is thirsty, no one is sick or naked or lonely or poor. The spiritual well-being of a society can be judged by the way it treats its most vulnerable members. The incarnate Christ is embodied in people who suffer. Society cannot separate its righteousness from its treatment of the poor and dispossessed. And the power of Christ dwells within a mass movement of marginalized people. Thanks be to God.